All right, welcome to Touchdown Talks. I'm Spencer Taylor. This is going to be my top 15 NFL wide receiver lists for fantasy for you in 2025. So, if you're about to draft here soon, this is going to be my list trying to help you decide which receivers to draft in the early parts of your draft. If you're in a standard size league, which should be about 12 teams or anywhere from 10 to 14 at the highest, maybe 8 if you're in a shallow league. This list is based as if you are in a 12-team league, however, as that is the standard in modern fantasy football. So that's what I'm basing this off of. But generally, for all those size of lists, you should have a chance to draft at least one of these players, is the idea. And I'm giving a little extra for you as well. So if you're wanting to stack up on wide receivers here in fantasy, you want to make sure that wide receiver position should be good for you. These are those players that you want to be going for, at least having one of these if you want to have a sure wide receiver position. Of course, nothing's guaranteed. But before we go further into it, I do want to remind you, please hit the subscribe button. Leave a like on the video. That will let me know that you enjoy this kind of content. You want more fantasy videos. Of course, you can also leave a comment for me, leaving your thoughts on it. Tell me what you thought of my rankings and, what I was wrong on or right on. And then without further ado, we'll get right into the video. But if you've hit subscribe, you won't miss on the next video, which is going to be my top 15 quarterbacks list. So if you want to know what quarterbacks to draft and where, or at least my second opinion on it, you'll know where to go. If you hit subscribe, you won't miss that video. So first on my list for wide receivers, at number 1, this shouldn't come as much of a surprise if you've looked at any fantasy draft boards yet for 2025. This is Ja'Marr Chase with the Cincinnati Bengals. Ja'Marr Chase is on average going number 1 overall in fantasy this year. I'm guessing a vast majority of drafts, Chase is going to be the number 1 off the board, if not 2 in some. But the reason for that is in 2024, Ja'Marr Chase finished with 403 fantasy points, and currently, by ESPN's projections, he's projected to get 339 in 2024, which would be quite a bit of a step back, but even still would be pretty high for a fantasy wide receiver. And Chase's value is not too hard to understand. He was first in fantasy in 2024, and for 2025, the Bengals, their roster, everything that we know about them, and how they played last year, and what we expect them to be this year, expect the Bengals to be playing in a lot of shootouts and needing to be able to win in shootouts. That's going to be the way they're going to have to win this year. At least that's the expectation. And, of course, with an offense that includes Joe Burrow as your quarterback and Ja'Marr Chase and T. Higgins at wide receiver, both of which, by the way, the Bengals did extend they gave a contract extension to Chase, franchise tagged T. Higgins, but with that trio of quarterback and wide receivers, and, of course, also with Chase Brown as your running back, this is a very potent offense that's coupled with a very bad defense, so they're going to need to win shootouts. And for you in fantasy, if you're lucky enough to be drafting number 1 and you draft Ja'Marr Chase, that is likely going to lend you plenty of really good fantasy points, so not much need to go too much further into that one. And number 2 on my list, he's going second on average for wide receivers, 4th overall. I agree with that placement. This is Justin Jefferson with the Vikings. He finished 2nd overall for wide receivers in 2024. So this would keep him, staying to form for wide receivers. The biggest thing for me that I would suggest considering when drafting Justin Jefferson this high, of course, if you're going to draft him, it's going to have to be this early. He's going to go off the board in the early first half of the first round for you. But if he's available when you're at him, you're only going to have one shot to take him. But the things that you want to consider when considering Jefferson over some of these other wide receivers or maybe a different running back is that Jefferson, one, has been sidelined for a lot of the offseason program due to a hamstring strain that he's been dealing with since late July. So that's something that could be a concern. Now, of course, Kevin O'Connell, the Vikings coach, sounds very confident that, and Jefferson himself as well, they both sound very confident that Jefferson's going to be 100% ready to go on week 1 for their Monday Night Football matchup against the Chicago Bears in Chicago. So again, that's the first thing to consider is the fact that he's been dealing with this hamstring strain. And then number 2 is Jefferson is going to have a new quarterback in J.J. McCarthy, who is effectively a rookie quarterback. So kind of a wild card there. If you think J.J. McCarthy is going to be all right, or at the very least, if you believe that he's going to very much rely on Justin Jefferson, which would make sense, of course, for any quarterback that has him to do that, go with Justin Jefferson. He'll be fine for you. If the injury thing this off season and the quarterback don't bother you, go ahead and take Justin Jefferson here. If you are concerned about those two things, you may want to go for a different wide receiver or a running back here. But Justin Jefferson, he's been a top wide receiver since he entered the league. I don't expect that to slow down very much, regardless of the roster that's around him. At number 3 on this list, I have CeeDee Lamb with the Dallas Cowboys. Considering the fact that his ADP in 2024 was number 2, only behind Christian McCaffrey in that draft, Lamb's wide receiver 8 finish in 2024 was a bit disappointing. Lamb only found the end zone 6 times in 2024. With that said, I do expect Lamb to have a bit of a bounce back season. I expect his stats this year to be closer to what he had in 2022 or 23. While I'm ranking him as the wide receiver 3, if you're in this position to draft, and if you're drafting in spots 5 to 6, if he and Jefferson are available, I wouldn't blame you for taking either wide receiver here. The biggest concern with CeeDee Lamb is just how are the Cowboys going to be in general, but whether the Cowboys are good or bad, he's their number 1 target. He's the guy that Dak Prescott's going to be leaning on, even if they've got backups in, if Dak gets hurt or something. Lamb is always going to be the number 1 target on offense for the Cowboys. They don't have a strong run game either, so they're going to be relying on the pass game. They're going to be going to CeeDee Lamb. As long as he's healthy, he's going to be their number 1 target, whether they're good or not. And I mean, heck, if the Cowboys are bad and they're trailing in a lot of games, that can help out for fantasy wide receiver as well. Forces that team to keep going to him throughout the game. So I do have CeeDee Lamb 3rd overall on this list. His overall draft position, or ADP right now, is at 6th. And then on number 4 on my list, he's number 5 on average for wide receivers this year. That is Amon-Ra St. Brown with the Detroit Lions. He's going on average 8th overall, so this is going to be mid to late first round pick here. He had a great 2023, 2024 that was about the exact same. Both years he surpassed 300 points. He finished in both of those. He finished as the number 3 wide receiver in each season. So, very good wide receiver. Of course, as I mentioned in the previous video for running backs, the biggest concern with or question around Amon-Ra St. Brown is how is the Lions offense going to look? What are the differences going to be, and what players is that going to impact? But regardless, I do expect Amon-Ra St. Brown to still be the number 1 wide receiver target. He's a great wide receiver. I expect him to get plenty of production. And again, I do, as much as I love Ben Johnson, and as a Bears fan who's excited to have him as the Bears' new head coach, I don't think that the Lions offense is really going to take as much of a step back as some people worry that it will. So, Amon-Ra St. Brown at an overall draft position of 8. If you're there, not a bad pick to take as your first wide receiver and first player off the board for you. Number 5 overall on my list, he's going on average 4th for wide receivers. I have Puka Nacua with the Rams. He's going 10th overall on average, so late first round pick here. But he obviously exploded onto the scene in 2023. Had a really great season there. 2024 was a bit of a letdown in his sophomore season. Part of that was due to missing 6 games and parts of 2 more. So really 8 games that he wasn't at full strength or wasn't playing at all. But regardless of that fact, Nacua's production value in the games that he did play was really good. The one concern for Nacua is touchdowns. He's only had 10 touchdowns in 28 career games. Now, of course, touchdowns in fantasy are a little bit finicky. Often it's better to rely more on receptions and yardage. If you've got assuming you're in a PPR league, if you've got one player who gets a lot of their points off of receptions and yards, and you've got another one that gets a lot of their points off of touchdowns, chances are the player that is getting their fantasy points off of the yards and receptions, that guy is generally going to be more consistent. So, for me, the fact that he's low on touchdowns isn't the most concerning. Now, of course, the low amount of touchdowns does maybe bring down his ceiling week to week, but he's been pretty consistent across the board when he has played. Has a pretty good points per game average, and I do expect him to play pretty well. Another concern I would want to bring up for you for the Rams in general and for Nacua is that the Rams quarterback Matthew Stafford has been dealing with some back issues in the offseason that have been covered and talked about by the team really oddly. Certainly a concern for a quarterback of his age. So, if Stafford was to go down, that might impact Puka Nacua's value, but I do expect him to be poised to have a top 5 or 10 fantasy wide receiver season this year. So, go ahead at this position. Not a bad spot to take him. Another receiver you could take around the same area, number 6th on my list, I have Malik Nabers, and that for the Giants. On average, he's going 6th for a wide receiver, and overall, he's going at 9th. So on average, he's actually going a little bit higher than Puka Nacua, but he's just a younger player. There's uncertainty about the Giants, and there's hype around Jackson Dart and how he's looked in the preseason, but I do believe the Giants are starting with Russell Wilson as the starting quarterback. Probably won't be long before Jackson Dart is in there starting, but there's uncertainty a little bit there as far as who's going to be throwing him the ball. But in 2024, Malik Nabers really shined as a rookie, had a high amount of their target percentage as an offense. Another concern that you could have for Nabers is that he has been dealing with various kind of lingering light injuries with a toe, a shoulder, back. So all have been pretty light, and it sounds like the Rams very much expect him to be ready to go for week 1. But, if you're ever at all if you're against drafting players this high that have any injury concerns, that might be something to consider here. But really, any of the last 3 wide receivers that I've talked about, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Puka Nacua, and Malik Nabers, any of these 3, this is the order I've ranked them in, but if you take them out of order or, you value them slightly different, wouldn't blame you. They're all going to be available around the same time in the late to middle first round for you. So, if you're drafting at pick 8 per se, go ahead and take whichever one of these 3 wide receivers you feel comfortable with. Number 7 for me at wide receiver, Also, that's his average for wide receiver this year. 14th overall, this is Nico Collins for the Texans. Collins had his best season in 2023. In 2024, he unfortunately missed 5 games, which hurt his fantasy value. Injuries are a bit of concern for Collins, as he's missed at least 2 games in all of his 4 seasons playing in the NFL. So injuries are a bit of concern, but for the Texans offense, they no longer have Stephon Diggs, so that's one less wide receiver he'll have to compete with for targets. Also, there's a lot of uncertainty about Tank Dell playing at all this year, so expect Collins to be the absolute number 1 wide receiver in Houston. And CJ Stroud, good quarterback. We know what he can do. He did have a slump this past season a little bit, but still a good quarterback. And Collins will be his number 1 target at wide receiver. And I do believe that he has top 10 fantasy value, especially on a per game basis this season. At number 8 on my list for wide receiver, we have Brian Thomas Jr. with the Jacksonville Jaguars. He was drafted 4th among wide receivers in the 2024 draft. That's exactly what his rank ended up being in fantasy in 2024 for wide receivers. He finished in the top 10 among wide receivers in both yards and touchdowns, despite ranking 29th in routes and 19th in targets. So didn't have necessarily the greatest amount of target share, or targets and routes overall, but when he was getting the ball, he was effective with it in 2024. So, and I do expect him to still be really good. He should be a reliable wide receiver 1 for you. And one concern that you could add to this is that because of the low amount of targets that he's gotten in 2024, he could be a bit inconsistent. As I mentioned before, when you're relying on being efficient with touchdowns and things like that for your points, that can lead to some week-to-week inconsistencies. But overall, still a good wide receiver. And taking him, his average draft position is 15th, so that's early second round for you. Not a bad pick for your first or maybe even your second wide receiver if you're double dipping really early. And then at number 10 for me on my list, 10th on average for wide receivers, and overall he's going 18th. We have A.J. Brown with the Eagles, still the number 1 target there. Brown finished 5th in 2023 for wide receivers, but in 2024 had a bit of a down year, mostly due to missing 4 games with an injury, and his targets went down a little bit on a per game basis. A lot of that, though, in 2024 was because the Eagles were leading in so many games, which, of course, you might expect is going to happen again. I do expect the Eagles to be a very good team this year. So that could end up hurting his fantasy value a little bit. But in his 4 seasons with the Eagles, he's never been worse than 13th in fantasy points per game. So Brown should be a pretty good wide receiver for you. He has been nursing a hamstring injury throughout August, but he is expected to be ready to play in week 1. So certainly consider him a fringe wide receiver 1. At number 10 on my list, I have Drake London with the Falcons. On average, he's actually going 9th for wide receiver, with an average draft position of 19. London is entering his 4th season, despite carrying a lot of hype going into both 2023 and 2022. In both seasons, he never cracked the top 40 for fantasy wide receivers, so he's had some disappointing years, but I do expect that this year could be a bit better for him. But he is one of those players that has a bit of a boom or bust potential. So he's one that if you're taking him here, you might be taking a little bit of a gamble. Even though he finished 4th in 2024, one thing to remember is that 40 of his points last season came in Week 18 against the Panthers. So, and then another 33 of those came in Week 5 against the Buccaneers. So, a bit of an inconsistent player. both week to week and even throughout his career. Bit disappointing. So yeah, this one's one that his average draft position is 19th, so that that's going to be mid to late second round for you, depending on the size of your league. Certainly a second rounder. I would view Drake London as fringe wide receiver 1, if not wide receiver 2 territory for you. If you go wide receivers really early, but most likely he's going to be a wide receiver 1 for somebody. And he certainly has the potential, but he's just going to be one of those ones that has some risk, and that's why he's going as a fringe wide receiver 1. Number 11 on my list, number 13th overall for wide receivers this year on average. His average draft position currently is at 31. We have T. Higgins with the Bengals. He did get the franchise tag from the Bengals, which means he may want to prove himself not only to the Bengals and other teams. He may want to prove that he's got that value and that he needs to be paid. And even though he's the wide receiver 2 on his own team, just behind Jamar Chase, that trio, as I mentioned before, they're going to need to be in shootouts, and they've certainly got the talent to do it. I see T. Higgins as a great wide receiver 2, if not a fringe wide receiver 1 for you in fantasy. Then at number 12 on my list for wide receivers is Ladd McConkey for the Chargers. He's on average going 11th for wide receivers with an ADP of 26 overall. As a rookie, McConkey ranked in the top 20 among wide receivers for receptions, yards, touchdowns, catch rate, yards per target, and yards per route run. So a lot of top 20s there for Ladd McConkey in his rookie season. Down the stretch, he ended 12th in fantasy points, 18th in points per game. So still a pretty good season, especially as a rookie. And in the latter half of the season and in the playoffs, McConkey really emerged as the wide receiver 1 and the top target for Justin Herbert. So the Chargers have added Trey Harris, and they've had Keenan Allen return at wide receiver for them. So those are some targets that could take away a little bit from Ladd McConkey, but I don't expect them to take away a whole ton. He's a pretty safe wide receiver 2 for you in fantasy. At number 13, I have Tyreek Hill with the Dolphins. In 2024, Hill's ADP was 3rd overall, so very high, and it was 2nd among wide receivers. But Hill struggled to stay healthy in 2024. Obviously, it was a very disappointing season for him and for the Dolphins as a whole. It was really one of his worst seasons in his career and his worst as a Dolphin. Unfortunately, this offseason, Hill hasn't been able to stay off the injury report for long. He's been dealing with a lingering oblique injury in August. He's currently expected to be ready to play in Week 1. And I would say that Hill is still a safe wide receiver 2 pick, but he's no longer like he used to be a wide receiver 1 in fantasy. So yeah, draft him more as a wide receiver 2. Hill is one of those players that, because of his name and the fame that he's had in previous years, he's one that if you really want to get him for, if you're really trying to get players at their average draft value or even hoping to get them later, you're probably not going to catch Hill because of his fame and his name. Even though last year was a bit of a down year for him, you might miss out on him because somebody that knew him from when he was on the Chiefs and still remembers that, or remembers his earlier years with the Dolphins. Some of those fantasy managers are going to have a tendency, because they recognize his name over others, they're going to take him earlier than they should. So if you're trying to go off of average draft value, that kind of thing, you're probably going to miss out on Tyreek Hill. But again, definitely has wide receiver 2 value now in fantasy, but just hard to really be safe with him as your wide receiver 1 at this point. Then on number 14th on this list, I have Jackson Smith-Njigba. That's right where he is on average in fantasy drafts so far. 14th for wide receiver, 32 overall. He finished 2024 with 253 points, which was 9th among wide receivers in 2024. He managed that while sharing a wide receiver room with DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett, both of which are now with different teams, which leaves Njigba as the easy, or Smith-Njigba, my apologies, as the easy wide receiver 1 for the Seahawks. They did add Cooper Kupp, but Cooper Kupp's near the end of his career, hasn't really been the same wide receiver in the last couple of seasons. Another question mark that you can have for Jackson Smith-Njigba is the fact that he's got a new quarterback in Sam Darnold. As far as that goes, how much do you feel like Sam Darnold's success was based off of being with Kevin O'Connell and the Vikings? If as long as you're confident that Sam Darnold's going to be okay, Jackson Smith-Njigba should be getting enough production in their pass game as the wide receiver 1. He should be a pretty safe wide receiver 2 pick for you. Has even the chance to crack into the top 10 this year, so he should be a pretty good wide receiver 2 pick for you. The last receiver on my list in this video, at number 15, is going to be Davante Adams with the LA Rams now. Now with his 3rd team in the league. Last year was a bit of a down year for him. He finished with 241.3 fantasy points, and he's now finished top 15 in fantasy points per game in the past 10 seasons. That's really impressive. Of course, he's not quite the wide receiver he used to be, which is why his average draft position now is 41st overall this year and 16th among wide receivers. So I'm just slightly higher on him than the average. But he's definitely a no doubt great wide receiver 2 pick, if not back end wide receiver 1. But of course, he's going to be behind Puka Nacua on the depth chart, or on opposing ends of the field. So he's going to have to contend with Puka Nacua for targets. But even with that, even if both have a successful season, I see Davante Adams as a pretty good wide receiver 2 target, if not a back end wide receiver 1. And of course, if something were to happen and Puka Nacua has a bad season, maybe misses some games, you could end up getting some wide receiver 1 weeks out of Davante Adams. So that'll round out my list for wide receivers. I hope you've enjoyed. Again, don't forget to hit the subscribe button. Make sure to hit the notification bell as well, so you don't miss any further videos. My next video will be on quarterbacks, so you won't want to miss it. Have a great rest of your day, and I will see you in the next video.